There is a stage of psychological development no one warns you about. A stage where you start seeing too much. You start noticing the ego in real time. You catch yourself defending an identity you didn't choose. You recognize propaganda patterns in headlines, conversations, even in your own thoughts. You hear group language and instantly detect tribal incentives. You notice how quickly fear compresses thinking, how quickly outrage creates certainty. And for a while, this new awareness feels empowering. You feel smarter, sharper, less naive. But then something strange happens. You start losing your footing. Because the mind was not built only to see truth. It was built to live. And living requires stability. This chapter is about what happens when awareness outpaces integration. When you've dismantled illusions, but haven't rebuilt structure. Most people imagine awakening as light. But sometimes awakening feels like dismantling your internal home while you're still living inside it. Your old identity structures used to do something important. They stabilized you. Even if the structure was flawed. Even if it was defensive. Even if it was based on stories. It gave you a coherent sense of self. It reduced uncertainty. It created meaning. When you suddenly see that identity is constructed, that morality can be tribal, that people can be manipulated, that your own mind is biased, you can experience a subtle internal collapse. Not dramatic, but real. A loss of trust in the mental scaffolding that kept you stable. And when mental scaffolding weakens, you become vulnerable, not only to manipulation, but to fragmentation. Because you no longer know what to stand on. Deconstruction is seductive. It gives you a sense of superiority over illusion. You can spot the ego, spot the fear, spot the manipulation, spot the hypocrisy, spot the social performance. And that ability feels like freedom. But deconstruction can become a trap when it becomes your identity. When you become a person who only dismantles. Because dismantling is easier than building. Dismantling requires critique. Building requires responsibility. Dismantling creates distance. Building demands commitment. And the nervous system often prefers distance because distance feels safe. So you can end up living in permanent analysis. Always seeing what's wrong. Always seeing what's fake. Always seeing how people are controlled. Always seeing the flaws in every narrative. Until the world starts feeling hollow. Not because the world is hollow, but because you trained your perception to search for illusion. And what you search for becomes what you see. Cynicism is often mistaken for clarity. Because cynicism sounds intelligent. It says, it's all manipulation. Everyone is self-interested. Nothing is real. Everything is power. People don't think. Cynicism gives a comforting sense of certainty. And certainty relieves anxiety. But cynicism is not deep understanding. Cynicism is a defensive posture against disappointment. It is what happens when you see patterns of deception and decide, I will never be surprised again. The cynic tries to prevent pain by eliminating trust. But eliminating trust eliminates connection. And connection is part of psychological health. So cynicism creates isolation disguised as wisdom. Here is what people miss. Even if beliefs are constructed, you still need a framework. You still need values. You still need a sense of direction. You still need commitment. Because human beings cannot live on skepticism alone. Skepticism is a tool, not a home. If you tear down your beliefs without rebuilding anything, you end up with meaninglessness, paralysis, emotional numbness, constant doubt, social disconnection, chronic suspicion. Some people call this being awake. But often it's just being unanchored. Awareness is not enough. You need integration. If you can question everything, you can question yourself into paralysis. You can question your goals, your relationships, your morality, your perception, your identity, your motivations. And at first this feels like intellectual integrity, but eventually it becomes psychological erosion. Because a life requires decisions. Decisions require values. Values require commitment. Commitment requires choosing something without total certainty. So the integrated mind learns a mature truth. You can never have perfect certainty, but you can have sufficient clarity. And you must act under uncertainty anyway. Integration is learning how to live with that reality. A key reason post-awareness destabilization happens is nervous system dysregulation. When you see manipulation everywhere, you enter vigilance. Vigilance is a threat state. In threat states, you become hyperalert, suspicious, reactive, mentally exhausted, socially guarded. You mistake vigilance for intelligence. But vigilance is not clarity. It's a physiological state. The mind in vigilance cannot integrate, because integration requires safety, not safety from the world. Safety inside your body. A calm nervous system is the foundation of psychological rebuilding. Without it, you don't build. You defend. Here is the paradox. When you see through ego, you can create a new ego. A subtler one. An ego built on, I'm not like the others. The ego of the awakened. The ego of the skeptic. The ego of the one who sees manipulation. This ego is dangerous because it is disguised as truth. It makes you feel above influence. But it can become just another identity cage. Because it keeps you in separation. It creates contempt. It reduces empathy. And it makes you harder to teach. The integrated mind avoids this trap. Because integration includes humility. The humility to admit, I am still influenceable. I still have blind spots. I still want belonging. I still rationalize sometimes. Awareness without humility becomes arrogance. Arrogance becomes isolation. Isolation becomes distortion. Deconstruction reveals the machinery. Integration builds a life inside that reality. Integration is a stable identity without rigidity, values without dogma, belonging without fusion, power without domination, meaning without illusion, clarity without paranoia. Integration is not about returning to naivete. It is about becoming stable after losing innocence. You don't go back. You go forward. To integrate, you need a psychological core, not a perfect self-image. A core that can hold uncertainty, contradiction, ambiguity, emotional discomfort, social disagreement. Most people collapse because their identity cannot hold complexity. So they run back to tribe, back to certainty, back to simplistic narratives. But integration means building a self that can stand in complexity without panicking. This is the foundation of maturity. This audiobook is not here to make you more skeptical. You've already done that. This audiobook is here to rebuild, to give you architecture, to give you a way to live, with open eyes, with stable values, with emotional regulation, with social belonging that doesn't require blindness, with power that doesn't require manipulation, with meaning that doesn't require delusion. This is the shift. From seeing to becoming. Chapter 2, Rebuilding Identity Without Ego Attachment. When you first discover that identity is constructed, it can feel destabilizing. You realize your beliefs were inherited. Your values were conditioned. Your personality adapted to survive. Your ego defends narratives more than truth. And for a moment, you may wonder, if identity is constructed, then who am I? This is where many people get stuck. They assume that exposing the ego means dissolving identity completely. But that is not integration. That is fragmentation. Identity is not the enemy. Unconscious identity is the problem. The task now is not to remove identity. It is to build one deliberately. The ego becomes dangerous when it is rigid, when it cannot change, when it must always be right, when it fuses with tribe, when it equates disagreement with threat. But identity itself is necessary. Without identity, you cannot make consistent decisions. You cannot commit to goals. You cannot build relationships. You cannot act coherently. You cannot orient your life. Identity provides continuity. It allows you to wake up tomorrow and still be the same person. The problem is not having an identity. The problem is confusing identity with truth. Identity is a functional narrative, not ultimate reality. And once you understand that, you can shape it consciously. Rigid ego says, "This is who I am. Period." Flexible self says, "This is who I am currently choosing to be." Rigid ego defends. Flexible self evaluates. Rigid ego collapses under contradiction. Flexible self updates. Rigid ego requires agreement. Flexible self tolerates disagreement. Integration means shifting from ego as armor to identity as architecture. Architecture can be renovated. Armor must be defended. Every human carries a narrative identity, a story that explains where you came from, what shaped you, what you value, what you struggle with, what you are becoming. This story organizes memory. It gives coherence to experience. But most people inherit their narrative passively. They accept the story that formed around them. Integration requires revising your narrative deliberately. Ask yourself, what parts of my story are defensive? What parts are excuses? What parts are unresolved wounds? What parts are borrowed from others? What parts are actually aligned with my values? You are not required to erase your story. You are required to edit it consciously. If identity is to be rebuilt, it must rest on chosen values, not inherited ones. Values are different from beliefs. Beliefs are claims about the world. Values are commitments about how you will behave. For example, belief, the world is competitive. Value, I will act with integrity even when pressured. Beliefs change. Values anchor. Integration requires asking, what principles do I want to live by even when it costs me? Not, what beliefs make me feel superior? Values stabilize identity without rigidifying it. Because values guide behavior. They do not demand certainty about the world. When identity collapses, people often feel powerless. They realize how influenced they are, how conditioned they are, how shaped they are. But integration requires reclaiming agency. Yes, you were shaped. But now you are responsible. You are responsible for regulating your emotions, questioning your beliefs, updating your narrative, choosing your values, correcting your mistakes, designing your direction. Victim identity is easy after deconstruction. Agency identity is harder. But agency creates strength. Without agency, awareness becomes despair. One subtle trap in rebuilding identity is constructing a new one around being awake. The ego of the integrated thinker. The ego of the sovereign mind. The ego of the one who sees through illusion. This is a sophisticated trap, because it feels justified. But superiority isolates, and isolation distorts perception. The integrated identity does not require being better than others. It requires being internally coherent. You do not need to be above anyone. You need to be aligned with yourself. An integrated identity has a stable core. That core includes emotional regulation, commitment to truth, moral principles, long-term orientation, tolerance for complexity. But it does not include ideological rigidity, tribal fusion, moral absolutism, fragility under disagreement. The stable core allows adaptation without collapse. Think of it like a tree. Deep roots, flexible branches. Storms bend it. They do not uproot it. You are not discovering a final self. You are constructing a functional one. And that construction continues. At different life stages, you will revise your priorities, your beliefs, your goals, your boundaries, your relationships. Integration does not freeze identity. It gives it direction. The question shifts from, who am I really? To, who am I choosing to become? That is the mature question. Identity must include your emotional range. If you deny anger, it leaks out. If you deny ambition, it mutates into resentment. If you deny vulnerability, it becomes coldness. If you deny fear, it becomes aggression. Rebuilding identity means allowing the full emotional spectrum, but integrating it, not being controlled by it. The integrated self can say, I feel anger, but I am not anger. I feel fear, but I am not fear. I feel pride, but I am not pride. Emotion informs. It does not define. When identity is rebuilt consciously, something changes. You no longer panic when challenged. You no longer collapse when criticized. You no longer require constant validation. You no longer defend every belief like survival depends on it. Because your identity is not fused with every idea. You can update without disintegrating. You can belong without dissolving. You can lead without dominating. You can disagree without hating. That is strength. Not dominance. Not certainty. Stability. Ask yourself, if I could design my identity intentionally, what would it include? What values would anchor it? What behaviors would express it? What principles would guide it? What emotional patterns would I need to regulate? You are not discovering a hidden essence. You are shaping a coherent structure. And that structure must be built deliberately. Because if you don't build it consciously, culture will build it for you. Chapter 3. Integrating the shadow into strength. You rebuilt identity. You stabilized the self. You chose values deliberately. But identity alone is not enough. Because beneath identity lies something older. Something less polite. Something less socially acceptable. Something you were trained to suppress. The shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is everything in you that was rejected. Rejected by family. Rejected by culture. Rejected by peers. Rejected by your own self-image. And what is rejected does not disappear. It goes underground, where it gains power. Integration requires facing it, not destroying it, not indulging it, integrating it. The shadow is not only your dark impulses, it is also your disowned strengths, aggression, ambition, sexuality, competitiveness, dominance, envy, resentment, neediness, fear, manipulation, jealousy, desire for recognition. These impulses are human. But many environments reward compliance and punish intensity. So you learned, this part of me is unacceptable. And you buried it. But buried energy does not dissolve. It waits. It leaks. It projects. When aggression is suppressed, it becomes passive aggression. When ambition is suppressed, it becomes resentment. When envy is suppressed, it becomes moral superiority. When fear is suppressed, it becomes control. When vulnerability is suppressed, it becomes coldness. When shame is suppressed, it becomes projection. The unintegrated shadow distorts behavior. Not because you are evil, but because you are divided. Integration is the act of reducing division. One of the clearest signs of an unintegrated shadow is projection. Projection occurs when you attribute your denied traits to others. If you deny your aggression, you see aggression everywhere. If you deny your desire for power, you see others as power-hungry. If you deny envy, you accuse others of jealousy. If you deny dishonesty, you become obsessed with exposing liars. The intensity of your reaction often signals projection. The more emotionally charged the response, the more likely something is being reflected back to you. The shadow you refuse to own becomes the enemy you fight externally. Integration requires asking, what in me is being triggered right now? Aggression is often confused with violence. But aggression is life force. It is assertiveness, boundary setting, drive, energy, momentum. Without aggression, you cannot say no, protect yourself, compete, build, lead, defend values. If you suppress aggression entirely, you become fragile. If you indulge it unconsciously, you become destructive. Integration means recognizing. Aggression is a tool. It must be regulated, not eliminated. Healthy aggression says, this is my boundary. This matters. I will not tolerate that. An integrated aggression says, I will dominate. I will humiliate. I will crush. The difference is awareness and regulation. Many people fear their own ambition. They fear becoming corrupt. They fear becoming selfish. They fear being seen as arrogant. So they shrink. But ambition itself is not corruption. It is directional energy. The question is not, should I have ambition? The question is, what is my ambition serving? If ambition serves ego inflation, it destabilizes. If ambition serves values and growth, it integrates. Shadow integration allows you to pursue strength without becoming tyrannical. Shame is one of the deepest shadow components. Shame says, I am flawed. I am not enough. I am defective. If people knew, they would reject me. Shame often drives perfectionism, overachievement, defensiveness, people-pleasing, aggression, withdrawal. If shame remains unconscious, it controls behavior. If shame is acknowledged, it softens. Integration requires facing shame without collapsing into it. You do not deny it. You do not let it define you. You recognize it as part of the human condition, and that recognition reduces its control. Underneath many shadow traits lies fear. Fear of chaos, fear of humiliation, fear of abandonment, fear of irrelevance. Control becomes the solution. If you control others, you feel safe. If you dominate, you feel protected. If you manipulate, you feel secure. But control without awareness becomes coercion. Integration means admitting, I want control sometimes. That admission is strength. Because what you admit, you can regulate. What you deny, regulates you. The shadow is not only negative. It contains raw creativity, sexual energy, competitiveness, intensity, risk tolerance, rebellion, passion. Many people suppress their boldness to fit in. They suppress their uniqueness to avoid judgment. They suppress their intensity to remain acceptable. Integration means reclaiming energy, not becoming chaotic, becoming alive. There is a risk in shadow work. Once people discover suppressed parts, they sometimes over-identify. They swing from repression to indulgence, from control to chaos, from politeness to aggression, from humility to arrogance. That is not integration. That is reaction. Integration is balance. Owning the energy without being owned by it. Integration requires ongoing self-observation. When triggered, ask, what part of me feels threatened? What trait am I condemning in others? What emotion am I avoiding? What power am I afraid to claim? What boundary am I afraid to set? Shadow work is not mystical. It is psychological honesty. And psychological honesty reduces fragmentation. When the shadow is integrated, you become harder to manipulate. Because you are not projecting, you become less reactive. Because you understand your triggers, you become less morally self-righteous. Because you know your own flaws, you become more powerful. Because you are not suppressing your drive, you become calmer. Because you are not fighting yourself. Integration creates internal alignment, and internal alignment creates stability. The goal is not purity. The goal is wholeness. You are not meant to be flawless. You are meant to be integrated. Ask yourself, what parts of me do I reject? What traits do I criticize most intensely in others? What desires am I ashamed to admit? What emotions do I refuse to feel? The shadow is not your enemy. It is unclaimed energy. And once integrated, it becomes strength. Chapter 4. Belonging without losing yourself. Human beings cannot thrive in isolation. You can dismantle ego. You can integrate shadow. You can regulate your nervous system. You can build a stable identity. But if you cannot belong without dissolving, you will either become isolated or absorbed. Neither is integration. Belonging is not optional. It is biological. But unconscious belonging creates fusion. Fusion creates distortion. So the task is not to withdraw from connection. The task is to remain intact inside it. From infancy, your nervous system learned something fundamental. Connection equals safety. When caregivers were present and responsive, your body regulated. When connection was threatened, stress increased. This wiring never disappears. As an adult, you still seek approval, recognition, affiliation, shared meaning. At the same time, you also seek autonomy, freedom, authenticity, individual direction. Belonging without losing yourself requires holding both attachment and autonomy. Most people swing between extremes. Over-attachment, losing self in relationships. Over-autonomy, avoiding intimacy to protect self. Integration is balance. Fusion happens gradually. You start softening your language, adjusting your tone, editing your opinions, avoiding friction, suppressing differences, not out of dishonesty, out of fear, fear of disapproval, fear of conflict, fear of exclusion. Fusion feels peaceful in the short term, but over time, it produces resentment, internal fragmentation, loss of clarity, identity confusion, because you are performing belonging instead of embodying it. An integrated people choose one, loyalty to tribe, or loyalty to truth. Integrated people practice dual loyalty. They value connection, and accuracy. This requires subtle strength. It means you can say, "I disagree. I see it differently. I'm not comfortable with that. I need to think more," without attacking, without humiliating, without collapsing. Dual loyalty allows you to stay in relationship while maintaining internal coherence. It is one of the highest social skills. Belonging fractures most often during disagreement. When someone challenges your belief or boundary, your nervous system activates. If unregulated, you either attack, withdraw, submit. Integration requires staying regulated long enough to think. Ask yourself in conflict, am I reacting to the content or to the threat of rejection? That distinction changes everything. Often what hurts is not the disagreement. It is the fear of losing connection. When you regulate that fear, you respond more clearly. Many people equate belonging with accommodation. They over-adapt. They tolerate disrespect. They tolerate misalignment. They tolerate behavior that contradicts their values because they fear being alone. But boundaries are not aggression. They are clarity. A boundary says, "I value this. I will not accept that. This is who I am." Healthy belonging requires mutual respect. If your belonging requires self-erasure, it is not connection. It is submission. Integration demands that you tolerate the discomfort of setting boundaries, because boundaries preserve identity. The hardest part of maintaining yourself in a group is the social cost. You may be misunderstood, judged, labeled difficult, excluded from certain circles. This cost activates ancient survival wiring, which is why so many people choose silence. But silence accumulates internal dissonance, and chronic dissonance becomes anxiety or resentment. The integrated mind accepts. Some belonging will be lost, but deeper belonging will be gained. Because authentic connection requires authenticity. Tribal belonging is based on identity markers: politics, religion, status, profession, ideology, subculture. Integrated belonging is based on shared values: integrity, curiosity, respect, growth, accountability, compassion. Identity-based belonging is fragile. Value-based belonging is resilient. When you build relationships around principles instead of performance, connection deepens. Because principles can survive disagreement, identity often cannot. There is a danger in integration. When you see tribal behavior clearly, you may feel above it, detached, superior. But superiority creates isolation, and isolation distorts perspective. You are still human. You still seek belonging. You still have blind spots. Humility is necessary to remain connected. Belonging without losing yourself does not mean distancing yourself from humanity. It means participating consciously. Honest dialogue is rare because it requires vulnerability. It requires saying, "I don't know. I might be wrong. That hurt. I'm unsure. I need clarity." These admissions feel risky, but they build trust. Integrated belonging is built on emotional transparency, not performance. When both parties can admit uncertainty and emotion without collapse, connection strengthens. There will be moments when maintaining your integrity costs you proximity. This can create loneliness. Loneliness is painful, but it is different from isolation. Solitude chosen for integrity is different from exile. Integration requires tolerating periods of solitude, because not every environment will align with your values. Temporary loneliness is better than permanent self-betrayal. The integrated person belongs without dissolving. disagrees without attacking, sets boundaries without cruelty, listens without surrendering judgment, engages without merging, steps away without bitterness. This is not easy. It requires emotional regulation, self-knowledge, and courage. But it creates stable connection. And stable connection strengthens identity. Ask yourself, where do I over-adapt to maintain belonging? Where do I avoid closeness to protect autonomy? What conversations am I avoiding? What boundaries am I afraid to set? What belonging is costing me authenticity? Belonging is not weakness, but unconscious belonging is. Integration transforms belonging into strength. Chapter 5. Power without corruption. Once identity is stabilized and belonging becomes conscious, something inevitable happens. You gain influence. Not necessarily political power. Not necessarily institutional authority. But influence. Over decisions. Over conversations. Over environments. Over outcomes. Power is not optional in adult life. If you refuse power entirely, you surrender agency. If you seek power unconsciously, it can consume you. Integration requires a mature relationship with power. Because power reveals the structure of your character. Power is the ability to affect outcomes. That is all. It is not inherently moral. Not inherently corrupt. Not inherently noble. Power amplifies what already exists. If you are insecure, power magnifies insecurity. If you are resentful, power magnifies resentment. If you are stable, power magnifies stability. If you are principled, power magnifies principle. The idea that power corrupts is incomplete. Power exposes. And exposure can feel like corruption. Power reduces friction. When you have influence, things move faster. People defer. Doors open. Obstacles diminish. This reduction in friction produces pleasure. It signals status, competence, authority. The brain rewards that experience. And the reward can become addictive. Once someone becomes accustomed to control, losing it feels threatening. That is where corruption begins. Not in evil intention. In fear of losing control. Earlier, you integrated aggression and ambition. Now you must examine how they behave under power. Aggression can become domination. Ambition can become exploitation. Confidence can become arrogance. Conviction can become intolerance. Power removes external restraint. So internal restraint becomes essential. Without self-regulation, influence becomes coercion. When someone gains authority, the ego often expands. Subtly, you begin to believe, I know better. I see more clearly. I'm responsible for others. I deserve this position. Some of this may be true, but if unchecked, it transforms into, I cannot be wrong. I must not appear uncertain. My judgment is superior. Dissent is disrespect. The integrated mind must constantly check ego expansion. Authority must not eliminate humility. True power is inseparable from responsibility. If your influence affects others, you carry weight. Responsibility means evaluating consequences beyond self-interest, protecting those with less leverage, tolerating criticism, accepting accountability, correcting mistakes publicly. Many seek the privileges of power. Few embrace the psychological burden. Integration requires seeing power not as entitlement, but as obligation. Manipulation is influence without transparency. It relies on emotional exploitation, misinformation, selective framing, pressure, guilt, fear. Influence becomes corrupt when it removes informed choice. Ethical influence, by contrast, presents information honestly, respects autonomy, invites disagreement, accepts rejection. The integrated person does not seek control of minds. They seek clarity in communication. One of the greatest tests of integration is how you behave when challenged under authority. Do you react defensively, silence critics, retaliate, shame dissent, withdraw respect? Or can you remain calm, evaluate criticism, admit mistakes, hold disagreement without humiliation? Power intensifies emotional stakes. So regulation becomes more important, not less. If your nervous system is unstable, power becomes dangerous. People in positions of influence often develop a subtle belief: my intentions are good. That belief can become moral immunity. It justifies bending rules for the greater good, dismissing critics as uninformed, overriding dissent as necessary, ignoring minority impact. Good intentions do not prevent harm. Power requires constant ethical calibration. Without it, rationalization becomes normal. There are two broad orientations toward power. Dominant power asks, how can I control this environment? Servant power asks, how can I improve this environment? Dominant power seeks compliance. Servant power seeks alignment. Dominant power prioritizes image. Servant power prioritizes outcome. The integrated individual chooses servant power, not as weakness, as maturity. Some people avoid power entirely. They fear corruption. They fear responsibility. They fear judgment. So they shrink. But refusal of power can also be avoidance. Because without power, you cannot protect values, set direction, create change, influence outcomes. Integration does not mean rejecting power. It means holding it consciously. One of the strongest protections against corruption is accountability. Not internal self-belief alone. External feedback, transparent processes, shared decision-making, open critique. Power without accountability distorts perception, because no one challenges you. The integrated person invites accountability, even when uncomfortable. Especially when uncomfortable. Whenever you exercise influence, ask, am I acting from clarity or insecurity? Am I seeking outcome or validation? Am I serving principle or ego? Would I act the same if no one knew? Can I admit error without collapse? These questions prevent subtle drift. Drift is how corruption begins. Not through dramatic shifts. Through gradual rationalization. When identity is flexible, shadow is integrated, belonging is conscious, and nervous system is regulated, power becomes less intoxicating, because you no longer need it to stabilize your self-worth. You can lead without merging with the role. You can influence without being possessed by authority. You can step down without collapsing. That is real strength. Ask yourself, where do I crave control? Where do I avoid responsibility? How do I react when challenged? Do I equate disagreement with disrespect? Do I use influence transparently? Power is not the enemy. Unexamined power is. Integration transforms power into stewardship. Chapter 6. Living with uncertainty, without panic. After integration comes instability. Not because you are broken, but because illusions have dissolved. Certainty is comforting. It simplifies the world. It reduces anxiety. It eliminates ambiguity. It offers belonging. It gives identity a stable anchor. But most certainty is constructed. And when you see that clearly, something uncomfortable happens. You lose psychological scaffolding. This chapter is about how to remain steady when the scaffolding falls. The nervous system is predictive. Your brain constantly anticipates. What will happen next? Is this safe? Is this familiar? Is this controllable? Predictability reduces cognitive load. Uncertainty increases vigilance. In ancestral environments, unpredictability often meant danger. So anxiety around uncertainty is not weakness. It is biology. But biology does not determine behavior. Integration requires expanding tolerance for uncertainty without triggering panic. Earlier, you dismantled false certainty. Now you must confront control. Control is comforting. It gives the illusion of mastery. But most large systems are too complex to fully control. Markets, relationships, social movements, institutions, public perception, even your own emotional reactions. The more you attempt total control, the more anxiety increases. Because total control is impossible. Integrated stability does not come from control. It comes from adaptability. Anxiety often arises from unanswered questions. What if I fail? What if they reject me? What if this collapses? What if I am wrong? The mind tries to resolve uncertainty by predicting worst-case scenarios. This feels like preparation. But it is actually rehearsal of fear. Integration requires distinguishing useful anticipation from catastrophic rumination. You do not eliminate uncertainty. You increase tolerance. When uncertainty becomes uncomfortable, people gravitate toward rigid systems. Ideology, extremism, conspiracy, absolute certainty, spiritual absolutism, political absolutism. Dogma reduces ambiguity. It tells you who is right, who is wrong, what to think, how to interpret events. But dogma trades anxiety for rigidity, and rigidity reduces cognitive flexibility. Integration requires resisting the pull of totalizing systems, even when they feel soothing. Flexibility is not indecision. It is responsiveness. It means updating beliefs when evidence changes, admitting uncertainty without collapse, holding multiple possibilities, remaining open without being gullible. Flexible minds adapt faster. Rigid minds defend longer. Uncertainty punishes rigidity. It rewards adaptability. Outcomes are uncertain. Effort is controllable. Values are chosen. Behavior is modifiable. When you attach stability to outcomes, anxiety increases. When you attach stability to process, anxiety decreases. You cannot control whether others approve. You can control whether you act with integrity. You cannot control global systems. You can control your response. This shift reduces panic. Because you anchor stability internally, uncertainty activates physiological arousal, racing thoughts, muscle tension, shortened breath, hypervigilance. If you interpret arousal as danger, anxiety escalates. If you interpret arousal as temporary discomfort, regulation improves. Integration requires slowing breathing, pausing response, delaying impulsive decisions, allowing incomplete information. Uncertainty is uncomfortable, but discomfort is survivable. No major decision is made with complete certainty. Career shifts, relationships, creative risks, leadership moves. Waiting for perfect clarity often leads to stagnation. Integrated decision-making includes gathering relevant data, recognizing limits of knowledge, clarifying values, acting within probabilistic understanding. You move forward not because certainty is achieved, but because direction aligns with values. Many people fear saying, "I don't know." They interpret it as weakness. But intellectual humility strengthens credibility. Admitting uncertainty prevents overconfidence, encourages learning, reduces defensive rigidity, promotes collaboration. The integrated mind does not cling to certainty to preserve image. It prioritizes accuracy over ego. Uncertainty is not purely threat. It is also potential. It creates innovation, exploration, creativity, reinvention, growth. Total certainty eliminates growth, because growth requires risk. Risk requires uncertainty. Integrated living reframes uncertainty as opportunity, not solely danger. Resilience is not absence of stress. It is recovery capacity. When uncertainty destabilizes you, the question is, how quickly do you recalibrate? Integration shortens recovery time. Because your identity is flexible. Your shadow is integrated. Your belonging is not fused. Your power is regulated. You are less fragile. So uncertainty does not shatter you. It challenges you. Short-term uncertainty feels intense. Long-term perspective reduces intensity. Ask, will this matter in 5 years? What is the broader trajectory? What patterns am I observing? What lessons can be extracted? Zooming out decreases emotional reactivity. It increases strategic thinking. Integration includes temporal depth. Ask yourself, where do I seek certainty to reduce anxiety? Where do I cling to beliefs for comfort? How do I respond when I don't know? Do I equate uncertainty with danger? Can I act without full clarity? Living without panic does not mean eliminating uncertainty. It means strengthening internal stability. Chapter 7: Deliberate Living, Building a Life that Reflects Clarity. Integration is incomplete if it remains internal. Self-awareness without action becomes stagnation. Insight without structure becomes abstraction. Clarity without embodiment becomes performance. You have stabilized identity, integrated shadow, balanced belonging, regulated power, tolerated uncertainty. Now the question becomes, what does a deliberate life actually look like? Because psychological wholeness is not a feeling. It is a pattern of behavior over time. Most people collect insights the way others collect quotes. They read. They reflect. They nod. They agree. But they do not restructure their lives. Deliberate living requires architecture. Architecture means how you spend time, what you tolerate, what you pursue, what you refuse, what you reinforce daily. Without architecture, identity dissolves under pressure. Structure protects integration. Your calendar reveals your hierarchy of values, not your declarations, not your aspirations, your time. If you value growth but allocate no time to learning, growth is not integrated. If you value health but neglect sleep and movement, health is rhetorical. If you value connection but avoid vulnerability, belonging is conditional. Deliberate living means aligning time allocation with declared values. Time misalignment creates internal dissonance. Dissonance erodes clarity. Your environment influences you more than willpower. Noise increases reactivity. Clutter increases cognitive load. Constant stimulation reduces depth. Unstructured input fragments attention. Integrated individuals curate environment deliberately. They choose information intake, social exposure, physical surroundings, digital boundaries. This is not control obsession. It is strategic design. Because clarity deteriorates under chaos. Attention is the most undervalued currency in modern life. Where attention goes, identity follows. If your attention is fragmented by outrage, comparison, or distraction, your identity fragments with it. Deliberate living requires protecting attention, not through isolation, through selectivity. Ask, what am I repeatedly feeding my mind? What emotional tone dominates my input? Is my attention reactive or intentional? Clarity requires mental hygiene. Habits stabilize identity under stress. When uncertainty rises, habits maintain direction. Resilient habits include consistent sleep, physical movement, focused work blocks, regular reflection, meaningful dialogue, time without stimulation. These are not self-help cliches. They are regulation mechanisms. Integration collapses when physiology collapses. You cannot sustain clarity in chronic dysregulation. Integrity is not moral perfection. It is behavioral alignment. When your actions match your principles, internal stability increases. When your actions contradict your principles, fragmentation returns. Small betrayals accumulate. Ignored boundaries. Avoided conversations. Suppressed honesty. Compromised standards. Each unaddressed inconsistency weakens identity. Deliberate living means correcting drift early. Integration requires subtraction. You cannot build deliberately while overcommitted. Saying yes to everything fractures attention. Saying no protects structure. Saying no is uncomfortable. It risks disappointment. It risks misunderstanding. It risks social cost. But without selective refusal, your life becomes externally driven. Deliberate living prioritizes direction over approval. Security without risk produces stagnation. Risk without reflection produces chaos. Integration allows calibrated risk. You act not from impulse, but from alignment. You evaluate. Does this expand capacity? Does this align with values? Does this build resilience? Does this deepen competence? If yes, discomfort becomes growth. Deliberate risk strengthens identity. Meaning is not found. It is constructed through contribution, creation, responsibility, commitment. If you wait for meaning to appear before acting, stagnation follows. If you act in alignment with chosen values, meaning accumulates. Deliberate living means choosing meaningful friction over comfortable drift. Comparison destabilizes deliberate living. It shifts orientation outward. Other people's trajectories are not your blueprint. Their pace, their visibility, their outcomes, their recognition. These are variables outside your control. Integration means measuring yourself against previous versions of yourself, not against external timelines. Comparison erodes clarity by distorting metrics. Your closest relationships either reinforce integration or undermine it. Ask, do the people around me support growth? Do they tolerate honesty? Do they challenge distortion? Do they respect boundaries? Deliberate living includes relational selection, not through arrogance, through compatibility. You cannot sustain clarity inside environments that reward confusion. Short-term gratification conflicts with long-term integrity. Impulsive reactions, temporary relief, immediate validation, avoidance of discomfort. These are tempting, but long-term orientation requires patience, delayed gratification, sustained effort, tolerance for slow progress. Integration is not dramatic. It is cumulative. Deliberate living does not mean emotional suppression. It means emotional honesty. You acknowledge fear, jealousy, fatigue, doubt, desire, but you do not let them dictate direction. You listen to emotion. You do not surrender to it. This balance preserves both humanity and stability. Integration is dynamic, not fixed. Circumstances change. Information updates. Values deepen. Deliberate living includes periodic reflection. Is this path still aligned? Have my priorities shifted? What needs adjustment? Where am I drifting? Recalibration prevents stagnation. Ask yourself, does my schedule reflect my values? Does my environment support clarity? Where am I leaking attention? What habits reinforce my identity? What must I subtract to strengthen direction? Where am I avoiding necessary risk? Deliberate living is not perfection. It is alignment repeated over time. Chapter 8: Psychological Freedom, Living Without Internal War. You have rebuilt identity, integrated the shadow, balanced belonging, regulated power, learned to live with uncertainty, structured your life deliberately. But even with all that, one question remains. Are you at peace with yourself? Because integration is not just coherence. It is the end of internal war. Psychological freedom is not perfection. It is the absence of chronic self-conflict. Internal war occurs when parts of you fight for dominance. One part wants achievement. Another wants rest. One part wants connection. Another wants autonomy. One part wants safety. Another wants expansion. When these parts are unconscious, they clash. You oscillate. You sabotage. You overcorrect. You regret. Freedom does not eliminate these parts. It organizes them. Psychological freedom begins with acceptance. Not passive resignation, but honest acknowledgement. You are imperfect. You are contradictory. You are limited. You are evolving. When you stop fighting your own humanity, tension decreases. Self-criticism may motivate in the short term, but chronic internal hostility fragments identity. Integration replaces condemnation with accountability. You correct behavior without attacking the self. Many people live as performers. They perform competence. They perform confidence. They perform spirituality. They perform morality. They perform intelligence. Performance consumes energy because it requires constant image maintenance. Psychological freedom allows you to step out of performance, not into carelessness, into authenticity. Authenticity does not mean oversharing or impulsiveness. It means your internal and external selves are aligned. Earlier, you learned to focus on process. Now you deepen that shift. Psychological freedom emerges when self-worth is no longer tied to outcome. Success does not inflate identity. Failure does not collapse it. Praise does not define you. Criticism does not erase you. You evaluate feedback, but you are not constructed by it. This detachment reduces volatility. Freedom does not eliminate emotion. It allows emotion to move. Sadness without identity collapse. Anger without destruction. Fear without paralysis. Joy without addiction. Emotion becomes information, not command. The integrated individual experiences deeply, without drowning. When identity is stabilized and values are clear, comparison loses power. You no longer measure worth against visibility. You no longer compete for validation. You pursue alignment. This reduces envy. It reduces insecurity. It reduces resentment. Freedom is not superiority. It is self-containment. Many people cannot sit in silence, because silence exposes unfinished conflict. Psychological freedom allows silence without anxiety. You are not running from yourself. You are not rehearsing arguments. You are not defending identity. You are present. Presence is not mystical. It is the absence of internal fragmentation. Freedom does not remove responsibility. It reframes it. You act deliberately. You own mistakes. You repair harm. But you do not carry unnecessary guilt. Guilt is useful when corrective. It is destructive when chronic. Integration allows you to learn without self-condemnation. Earlier, you reconstructed identity deliberately. Now you hold it lightly. Identity becomes flexible. You can update beliefs, shift directions, admit change, because identity is no longer rigid armor. It is adaptive structure. Freedom includes flexibility. Psychological freedom accepts ambiguity. You do not require complete answers to feel stable. You can say, "I'm still learning. I may revise this. I don't fully know." This humility strengthens resilience. Rigid certainty feels strong, but flexible clarity endures longer. When internal war ends, coherence emerges. Thought aligns with action. Values align with behavior. Emotion aligns with context. You are not split between masks. You are not battling hidden impulses. You are not suppressing essential parts. You are integrated. Integration creates energy, because energy is no longer wasted on self-conflict. Psychological freedom expresses itself quietly. You respond rather than react. You choose rather than compulsively comply. You pause before speaking. You tolerate discomfort without immediate escape. You admit error without collapse. You disagree without hostility. You rest without guilt. You pursue growth without desperation. This is strength without aggression. Confidence without arrogance. Clarity without rigidity. Freedom is not the absence of limits. It is conscious engagement with limits. You cannot eliminate uncertainty. You cannot eliminate mortality. You cannot eliminate complexity. But you can eliminate unnecessary internal conflict. You can live deliberately. You can act with integrity. You can tolerate ambiguity. You can integrate shadow. You can belong without dissolving. You can hold power without corruption. That is psychological freedom. Ask yourself, where am I still fighting myself? What part of me am I condemning? What outcome defines my worth? What identity am I afraid to release? What performance am I tired of maintaining? Freedom is not external. It is internal coherence.